All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this virtual webinar. I'm Jason Landrum, a Senior Program Officer with the Lenfest Ocean Program. And so just welcoming everyone to this wonderful opportunity to engage with one of our projects. For those of you that aren't yet familiar with our program, the Lenfest Ocean Program is a grant-making program that funds ocean and coastal research projects that address the needs of stakeholders, rights holders, and/or decision makers. You can learn more about us and the projects we fund at www.lenfestocean.org. And while you're there, please sign up for our newsletter. If you're on Twitter or X, follow us at Lenfest Ocean, and Vicky Bell will be live tweeting throughout the event. Before we get started, I'd first like to offer a land acknowledgement. From the coast to the deep water and across boundaries and borders, we would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of Indigenous peoples that have called these lands and waters home since time immemorial. Washington, D.C. sits on the ancestral lands of the Anacostans, also documented as Nacotchtank, and the neighboring Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples. For today's webinar, we are honored to have Dr. Jane McMillan, John Paul, Carrie Prosper, Tyler Sack, and Dr. Shelley Denny to share the goals and ongoing progress of their project to advance dialogue and reconciliation between First Nations and non-Indigenous fishing communities in Atlantic Canada through knowledge exchange and leadership engagement. My colleague Emily Knight will drop a link to their project in the chat, so please check out that resource if you haven't already done so. The project team will soon delve into the details of their project, but first, from the Lenfest side, this project is part of a larger body of work that we are supporting in the Including Indigenous Knowledge and Ocean and Coastal Evidence-Based Decision-Making portfolio. As we all know, the traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples has historically been overlooked, underappreciated, and underrepresented in decision-making processes, thereby impeding effective conservation and restoration of marine ecosystems. Earlier this year, we announced 8 grants awarded through our open request for proposal process that was completed last year. And these projects represent a concerted effort to cultivate collaborative approaches that elevate and include the rich traditions, culture, and wisdom of Indigenous peoples and evidence-based decision-making in the United States and Canada. We are dropping a link in the chat in case you'd like to read more about this portfolio topic and its funded projects. And more webinars are coming, so please register for additional project webinars in this portfolio area. And my colleague Emily is going to drop another link so you can register for these future webinars. A few housekeeping rules before we get started. Today's webinar, all attendees are muted. With so many attendees, we wanted to minimize any audio disruptions during the event. We will host a live Q&A session at the end of the webinar, but if questions come up during the webinar, please submit them in the designated Q&A chat area, and we'll get to them at the Q&A session at the end. Please also share any resources or comments in the chat, and we will track those throughout the event as well. With that, I'd like to pass it over to the project team to dive into the webinar and this wonderful project. Jane and hopefully Carrie is able to join us. Please take it away.
Thank you very, very much, Jason. It is a privilege and honor to be coming at you from Mi'kma'ki territory here today. Unfortunately, Elder Carey's having a bit of technical difficulty. He's over in PEI at a climate change conference, and he's working really hard with his grandson to do some knowledge translation to get him here. So we'll hope for the best. But we are really grateful to Lenfest and Pew Foundation for this opportunity to conduct the work of trying to engage Indigenous and non-Indigenous fishers in productive dialogue, finding common ground to make sure that we sustain the resources and livelihoods of the people working in those resources for the millennia to come. And our work is really grounded in understanding the time immemorial connection of Indigenous peoples in Atlantic Canada with the territories in which they have occupied for 14,000 years. And I'll talk a little bit about that time immemorial connection and bring us up to the present, which sets the context for our research project in that dialogue and engagement work. And then I'll turn it over to John Paul, who will talk about the 25th anniversary of the Marshall Decision, one of the pivotal decisions relating to treaty and Aboriginal rights here in Canada. And then our two special guests, the wonderful Tyler Sack and Dr. Shelley Denny, who will share their incredible wisdom and the work they're doing on the front lines of fisheries and oceans work. So, of course, many Indigenous people throughout the world have fundamental and sacred relations with the sea through which their cultural identities emerge socially, economically, politically. The Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, Wolastoqey, Penobscot are Indigenous peoples in the Atlantic whose territory has spanned the Gaspé Peninsula, the provinces of Atlantic Canada, the northeastern United States. And we call this territory collectively Mi'kma'ki. Prior to European settlement, the Mi'kmaq obtained up to 90% of their dietary needs from the ocean and rivers in their territories. Eels, cod, salmon, shellfish, including lobster, sea vegetables, seals, and whales, they were all in regular abundance. And evolving fishing technologies included cooperative stone weirs, basket traps, hooks, lines, spearfishing. The Mi'kmaq watercraft included birch bark canoes. They could sail. The flexibility in resource extraction strategies enabled the Mi'kmaq to successfully live and reproduce their populations for millennia. And the abundant and relatively stable food supplies permit greater population densities to survive, and possibly resulting in the development of complex cultures. And we know for certain that the Mi'kmaq did develop into very complex, sophisticated, rich cultures. The significance of Mi'kmaq relationships with their marine life were incorporated in every facet of their pre and early life, from cosmological belief systems to political family organization. The premises of Mi'kmaq traditional fisheries were both spiritual and practical, focusing mainly on the well-being of survival of families and community members by practicing seasonal rounds. So they knew the territory intimately, they traveled it extensively, they harvested collaboratively for the benefit of all. The subsistence activities were governed by the concepts of Nuduklumek, which guided harvesting practices and aimed at coexistence. Subsistence customs reflected the holistic interconnectedness of Mi'kmaq laws embedded in their tribal consciousness and governing their behavior, particularly in relation to establishing means for survival, such as harvesting and sharing and providing and honoring procurement skills. So this concept of Nuduklumek denoted the proper customary practice of seeking the bounty provided for the self-support and well-being of the individual and the nation. The Mi'kmaq prospered in their fisheries for thousands of years. And this prosperity, though, was significantly interrupted by the aggressions of European settlers and colonizers. And the hostilities between the French and the British and the Mi'kmaq escalated as Mi'kma'ki was undergoing vigorous transformation as British colonists began to claim more and more of the landscape, changing the names, clearing the lands, building walls, and forcing Indigenous peoples away from their resource-rich homelands. But the British could not simply ignore the Mi'kmaq, who had allied with the French, as their retaliatory efforts interfered with British commercial designs in the fish and the fur trade. So the British had to come up with alternate strategies. One solution to Indigenous resistance was to enter into peace and friendship treaties with the Mi'kmaq and other Indigenous signatories, while simultaneously distributing bounties for Mi'kmaq scalps. So if you can imagine the relationship tensions. Mi'kmaq understood the treaty to protect their sovereign and sacred relationships to their territories and their resources. The first articles of the peace and friendship treaties, which were signed back in 1725, are a chain of treaties signed by the Mi'kmaq, the Wolastoqey, the Passamaquoddy, and the Penobscot delegates. And these were to guide the future relationships between the British and all of the colonies. The second set of articles encompass the reciprocal relations and promises that were made to Indigenous communities by the officials, the colonial officials. Now, Indigenous peoples were certainly resistant to English encroachment on their lands, and they emphasized the historical priority as being the first inhabitants for thousands and thousands of years and the rightful owner over their territories, rejecting the notion of anyone else holding jurisdiction over them or their resources. Indigenous nations asserted and continue to assert their autonomy and any right to settle their lands derived from their authority, not from somebody, an invisible king in a foreign land. So the British signed not just one treaty with the Mi'kmaq, but 5 separate agreements over 53 years, from 1726 to 1779. And in the reciprocal promises of the treaties, it was guaranteed that Indigenous hunting, fishing, and gathering assets and strategies would be protected. After a long period of treaty denial, the imposition of colonial laws and regulatory frameworks alienated and marginalized Indigenous peoples from, and in fact criminalized them in their livelihoods. And for a long period of time, Mi'kmaq participation in commercial fisheries was significantly limited. Jump ahead to the 1990s, and I'll turn it over to John Paul, who is the executive director of the Atlantic Policy Congress of First Nations Chief Secretariat and one of the co-principal investigators in this research project, to tell us about the landscape in Mi'kmaq in the 1990s, and then the fishing case that we were all involved in on this call, and we'll tell you about our experiences in the case that ultimately culminated in the Supreme Court of Canada deciding that the 1760 and 61 treaties protected the Mi'kmaq right to fish for moderate livelihood. So I'm going to turn it over to you, John. You're muted, though.
That'll be better. Thank you, Jane. And, you know, I've been working on fisheries and other things for our First Nations across Atlantic Canada, including the Gaspé Peninsula and Quebec, for over 30 years. And, you know, the Marshall decision at the Supreme Court was a pivotal decision that changed people's mindset about what was possible in terms of creating economic prosperity and growth in the communities based on what we believe. And at the time, there was supposed to be 2 separate processes to be set up to deal specifically with the fishery and to deal with other rights related to the Marshall decision. But in my case, the major focus was in terms of the fishery and additional commercial access to our communities across our region, and their willingness to participate or be provided access based on a government regime that provided licenses, equipment, and training to allow communities to exercise their rights as affirmed by the court. All of this was done under the existing Fisheries Act, which many objected to, but at some point a lot of commercial access was transferred to communities by individual agreements that allowed an explosive expansion of, one, the number of people interested in fisheries, as well as having to build significant capacity and expertise to manage the many vessels and fishers that would undertake the commercial fishery enterprise for a community. And during the first couple of years, it was total chaos, just to say the least. And many communities made many different types of mistakes trying to learn basically the intricate complexities of operating in a very competitive industry that ensures that, one, you operate safely, but at the same time, you create a commercial benefit, which is transferred to the fisheries and as well as transferred to the community. And in a lot of cases, any revenues or additional revenues earned by communities were reinvested in other programs and services and needs that were not funded by federal programs or services provided by Indigenous Services or Health Canada, and really filled a large gap in terms of services and investments that allowed for additional services in communities, but also allowed communities the financial ability to make choices and develop many new economic opportunities. And in the case of one community I'm aware of, the additional return from the fishery for the community generated between 10 and 11 million dollars a year per year over the last 25 years. So the community made the decision on what to invest those extra funds in, whether it be community services, whether it be economic development, and at the same time, it increased the number of employees and wealth among great many young people in our communities who previously had very little experience in the fishery, usually got trained as deckhands and then captains, and entered the fishery probably at a very young age. And that was in 1999. They were only in their early 20s or a little older in some cases. But 25 years later, these same individuals that have worked on an ongoing basis in the communities, either as fishers, deckhands, fleet managers, or directors of fisheries, commercial operations, have basically position themselves in leaders in what goes on in communities, because they have generated, I'd say, a generation of wealth in the communities that they can use to further benefit their families and as a collective benefit communities. And the revenues generated by this ongoing activity has grown exponentially from 1999 to today to, I think it's about 1,700 jobs and, in excess of $130 million a year in revenues. And all that money goes back to the communities in a lot of cases and generates that sense of well-being and security that we've always strived to dictate our own future and dictate our own past. At the recent events that we held on the anniversary of the Marshall decision, many people came there with their story and their perspective of what the Marshall decision has meant to them as legal people or as community people or fishers or just ordinary people. And everybody described that little different perspective of how they were all involved in terms of this monumental change in thinking and the mindset of our communities to actually have the ability to exercise commercial rights and develop revenues and salaries, basically, in some cases, in a fishery where you were totally excluded in the past. And it's has created a lot of change in the communities over 25 years, with 1,800 people actually engaged in the fishery every year, and growing now as in the last couple of years more and more people have entered the fishery. And it's becoming a very good living in a lot of cases for communities. Some communities are doing moderate fisheries where they're only generating enough income to survive. But the major enterprises of the communities are still driven by a profit-centered motivation to maximize employment, maximize revenues, and maximize the amounts provided back to the community for reinvestment in other priorities of the community. I think that for young people, it really changed their perspective of what is possible versus always having to think about looking for the same types of opportunities that you only see in your community. And I think that the fishery and the different aspects of the fishery, whether it be in aquaculture, marine servicing, or other things, has really expanded the scope of opportunity of individuals in the communities. Things that never existed now exist, and now communities are looking to each other to expand those opportunities to develop, basically develop more opportunities and more employment and more enterprises that people can actually benefit in the community. And I think that the webinars that occurred last week really provided a picture over time of how much things have actually changed from 1999 to 2024, and how much we all recognize that our increased involvement in the commercial fishery, as well as the moderate livelihood fishery and food fishery, has really become a cornerstone of our communities. And most recently, when we had a meeting with our leaders about economic development and economic reconciliation, one of the important pieces that many highlighted was how the fishery in many communities is the cornerstone of where communities are going. And, most recently in September, I went out to see the epicenter of where the conflict occurred on the water, in some cases post-Marshall, in terms of the conflict between non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people and the government of Canada. And it's interesting to see that in their community, Espanotigic, or Burnt Church as many call it, has developed a very professionally run and operated food fishery, which they manage, control, and govern themselves in the community so that the benefits of the fishery actually do go back to the community. And they monitor and govern the whole process themselves. And to boot, they also process all their FSC lobster in their own processing facility, which they own and operate in Caraquet, which is a large modern processing facility, which is one of the leading processors of snow crab in Caraquet in northeast New Brunswick. And it really demonstrates the exponential ability of communities to use the fishery as a tool to create prosperity, opportunity, but also demonstrate their ability to govern such an important fishery for their own community. So with that, I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, John. And that really it's a great segue for hearing from Tyler. Tyler grew up in both Passamaquoddy and Membertou First Nations. He got a bachelor's of arts in sociology and anthropology, pardon me. I should know better, right? As an anthropologist from St. Mary's University, and a Master of Arts in sociology from the University of Guelph. After working for Membertou First Nations in communications, he became the manager of research and analytics for Orenda Software Solutions, an artificial intelligence company that uses social media to measure public perception. He is a 2022 alumnus of the Governor General's Canadian Leadership Conference, and he made such an impressive performance there. He was named as an Action Canada Fellow for the 24-25 program, which is a very prestigious and competitive appointment. So congratulations on that. And Tyler's currently working on a public policy paper related to the future of natural resource sector in Canada. Now, today, Tyler Sack is the Director of Aquatic Resources and Fisheries Management for the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq. He'll tell us a little bit about that. He was formerly the Director of Governance. He's got this new role since early in 2024, and the position really is focused on enhancing collaborations and innovative solutions in Mi'kmaq. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today, Tyler. Thanks.
Well, Lal and Jane, for that very generous introduction. And of course, it's an honor to be part of this. I regretfully was not able to join the sessions at St. FX earlier this year on Marshall Ad 25. But I know that our organization had a big presence there, and I'm very happy to see that it went well, and always happy to be part of any discussions on reconciliation today and into the future. So as Jane mentioned, yeah, I grew up in Sabaganegadik and am a band member of Membertou First Nation. So both are, I consider both communities home, and I always like to place myself in community whenever I'm introducing myself. So I'm the son of the late Richie Sack of Sabaganegadik, and my mother is Stephanie Elaine Gould from Membertou. Grew up in both communities, and part of why I got into what I do for school, going into the university level, seeing, like, when I was a child, the media depictions of what Indigenous people are supposed to be. So if you think back to like Disney movies like Peter Pan, and there's a famous scene in there where the song is "What Makes the Red Man Red." I wanted to figure that out from the time I was a little kid to in adulthood. Why don't we look like that today? Why don't we act like that today? That was the basis of my academic career. So I'm not an ecologist. I'm not a biologist. I'm a sociologist, specializing in post-colonial theory. If you wanted to look into more of like direct influences, I recommend, and especially with the topic today of talking about reconciliation, post-colonialism is probably the field to look into, specifically the works of Spivak, Homi Bhabha, Bell Hooks, and Frantz Fanon. And just for the academic and theoretical framework, and then looking into the specifics, Glenn Coulthard, excellent resources, book called Red Skin, Red Masks. Excellent, and touches on everything from governance and self-determination to land and resource management. So I joined the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq in 2020 at the height of the pandemic, because why not? It was a scary time. What a more appropriate time for a career change and move. And the new department that was created was on governance and what that means. So it was mostly about domestic diplomacy at the time of the Mi'kmaq nations in the tribal council with mainland Mi'kmaq and how they relate to the Crown, that being the province of Nova Scotia and the federal government through Crown Indigenous Relations and Indigenous Services Canada. We're at a point in time now at this critical juncture where the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is law in Canada. It is no longer a suggestion. It is no longer soft law. It's becoming Canadian policy and legislation has to change and has to be consistent with and uphold those articles. So everyone, if you haven't read it, take time to really read through it and what that means. Those articles outline human rights for the Indigenous people in Canada, as well as self-determination, that being over their own governance structures, but also the lands, territories, and resources that are in those territories. And if we're going to consider the doctrine of discovery, which is the basis for Canadian or colonial title in Canada, as morally unjust and legally invalid, then title has to appeal back to treaty. And we have to look at implementing treaty in a modern context and building off of decisions like Marshall. What's interesting, though, I shouldn't say what's interesting, the struggle of what we continue to come up against, the resistance between Canada and our own assertions of title and self-determination and self-government come with, it's a loaded deck, as we all know. Canada is in a position of conflict of interest where they're judge and jury, and we have to appeal to the mechanisms that exist today. And every nation needs an economy, and we're kind of in an impoverished system after being subject to cultural genocide for about 4 centuries. We're not exactly on equal playing field. So when we're talking about reconciliation and access to resources and recognition of rights, we're talking about equality. All of these things are interconnected. So the work that we do here at CMM is program and service delivery. Since post-Marshall, we've been doing work on scientific literacy and communication, as well as assisting with resource management on culturally significant species, their habitats, and habitat restoration. But it wasn't until 2012 when the Department of Aquatic Resources and Fisheries Management started to look the way it does in a modern context, or how it looks today. So we do a lot of knowledge generation, knowledge transfer, and looking at what the traditional knowledge and Mi'kmaq ecological practices were, and how kinship and stewardship relate to the Mi'kmaq access to and harvesting, and how we take care of our home, and it takes care of us, and what that looks like for us informing Canadian models of resource management and habitat restoration. Fundamentally different ideologies, but it is a process and progress over perfection. We don't have the solution just yet, but we are working toward that. We know that the priority is, as outlined in the Covenant Chain of Treaties and the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and appealing further back to our creation stories, is that we did have a concept of land ownership. We fought wars over borders. We knew what the boundaries were. We had complex structures of governance that went internationally, as evidenced by the Wabanaki Confederacy, where the health of communities and families was paramount, and that how to redistribute access and who hunted where and when, who fished where and when, and took care of one another. It's indicative of a system that was not capitalistic, not capitalist by nature, but and it isn't necessarily a romanticized version that you would see in other Disney films or popular mythology of Canada, where the narrative was that we were animal-like. We were very much human-like. We just knew that we couldn't govern over a system, but were part of a system and played a role in that. So what we're looking at now is our mission of promoting and restoring the concept of Nedigal and what that looks like. The world is different today. We know that, and that since the time of the fur trade, the commodification of species and resources has really compromised spiritual and cultural nature of fish and resources. But we're trying to restore that again and look at moderate livelihood is not about getting rich, but it is about equality. So what we're talking about here is access, equality, and justice, social justice. So at every juncture that we've tried to assert our rights since 1999, whether it's Escanovich, whether it's Saulnieville, or whatever it is, we've been met with violent resistance, racism, and violence at every point. And the most recent one in the Saulnieville example, we have social media today where we didn't previously, and we could see all of these things happening in real time. And part of what inspired me to get over into this line of work was that I have friends and family who were faced with the violence and the racism, and were face to face with it. They have post-traumatic stress disorder now to the point where they don't want to be part of this anymore. They wanted to change careers when it is their right, as outlined by all of these international agreements of nation to nation, and is their right, not a privilege. So getting to that point of empowering our people to have the confidence to assert jurisdiction, to assert the right, and to do it in a way that is inherently about the conservation and dignity of the resource, not exploitative. One of the great examples that I am looking to replicate is Nez Perce tribal fisheries and natural resources. Very great example of where that nation has a shared jurisdiction with the state in the United States, in California, where they can influence state jurisdiction, and it's not just a one way. And that's something that Canada can really learn from. Canada has a really bad habit, and it's not just in natural resources, of what's called a despotic governance system, where it's a walk along government, where they want to assimilate our people to mimic the colonizer. It's clearly a broken system. It's flawed. It's not going to work. So what will, and that's where the process of reconciliation has to inform it, is it's not one-way communication or a one-way delegation of authority. We have to appeal back to the treaties and what they say, and looking at how they're implemented. We currently have an Indian Act and a Fisheries Act. There is no Treaty Implementation Act, which is probably a huge oversight on the Crown's. Finally, what I want to hit on is, in what we're doing, is related to the UNDA Implementation Act. When we did our engagements with community and looking at how do we align Canada's laws to fit with this declaration and the articles, the number one thing that came back that needs to change is the Fisheries Act. Number two was the Indian Act. So just to get an idea of what the priority is for our people. And with that, I will send it back to you, Jane.
Thank you so much, Tyler, and thank you for your incredible insights and your direction. It makes me really hopeful and optimistic that these relationships can truly get sorted in positive ways for everyone, but with the true recognition of what needs to happen in the rebalancing. It's now my pleasure to turn over to Dr. Shelley Denny. Some moments for her reflections and participation. And I had the privilege of being the external reviewer on Dr. Shelley's recent, it's not that recent anymore, I guess, PhD a couple of years ago. And it was such an impressive piece of work. I encourage everyone to read it. It is called Doing Treaty, an alternative fisheries governance model for Mi'kmaq Aboriginal and treaty rights to fish in Nova Scotia. She's done some exceptional work and on the ground working with frontline fishers and figuring out just the nature of the practice and the best way to sustain and harvest the resources for the benefit of all. Dr. Denny is the senior advisor for the aquatic research and stewardship for the Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources. She attended Acadia University for her Bachelor in Science and Biology, and then her Master's in Biology at St. Francis Xavier, and her PhD at Dal. Her research interests are in exploring the ways Indigenous and Western knowledge can be used for the benefit of all, known as two-eyed seeing. Her doctoral research built on her current interests and experience at UINR by exploring how Indigenous and treaty fisheries can be governed. She really is a passionate lover of eels as well, and I think we're kindred spirits in that regard. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you're very busy, Dr. Denny. Welcome.
Well, and Jane, thank you. Yeah, I think that I was, hoping to talk a little bit about, the intersection of my organization and, the reconciliation with non-Indigenous fishers. And our organization, the Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources, or UINR, was established as a collaboration of Unama'ki or Cape Breton First Nations to look into environmental concerns that were common to all of our First Nations in Unama'ki. And at that time, there was dredging in Middle Shoal, and that was done in the Bredor Lakes and done without any kind of communication or consultation on how that activity could potentially impact fish and fish habitat in Bredor. So in 1999, UINR became a registered society with, 3 goals that we really don't stray too far from. We are considered a technical-based organization, and we're not often thought of as a rights-based or a treaty-based organization. We do have those organizational goals that for the most part align Mi'kmaq worldview and ways we govern ourselves around the gifts provided by Creator. And our goals at UINR are to provide Mi'kmaq equal participation in natural resource management in Unama'ki and in traditional territory, which is a little bit more broader than obviously Unama'ki, and that's our governance goal. We strive to strengthen Mi'kmaq research and natural resource management while maintaining our traditions and worldview. So we see that as our two-eyed seeing goal. And also to partner with other groups who have that same desire to protect and preserve the Bredor Lakes as we do for our future generations. And that's our partnership goal. And, while my background is in natural science, I did grow up in my work world under what I call the school of Charlie Joe Dennis. And Charlie Joe was a very important role model for us all. And he was a great collaborator, a great inspiration who was able to bring people together and to have those important conversations that we need to have. And I guess at the time, growing up in my work world, I hadn't realized how much of a value that was to Mi'kmaq society. And we see that even in our creation stories, that there's an understanding that we don't all have the capacity or the knowledge to get things done. And there's certain people and certain parts of society that we rely on for those certain things. So Charlie taught us a lot about, integrity and respect and, partnership and collaboration. So we're very much in debt to Charlie's relationship building that he had been doing for most of his career. And I think UINR is fortunate to have been part of that opportunity. So while we're not specific to rights-based implementation of fisheries, and as Tyler had mentioned, that equal participation in natural resource management and maintaining our traditions and worldviews while doing so is that practice and application of Mi'kmaq rights. And UINR themselves, we're very much part of the Mi'kmaq knowledge system. We work within it and among it, and we're very knowledgeable in our values and beliefs and how it informs Nedigalunk and Sonogama and two-eyed seeing and how we can incorporate that on the ground. And this is ultimately what we learned from our knowledge keepers. It's not something that we pulled from books. This is something that we've incorporated processes in order for us to be able to have that deeper understanding. And, with partnerships as our third goal, we're really lucky to have both academic and government partnerships, as well as NGOs, including, fisher associations. But we're also paving the way in which we partner with community and even Mi'kmaq and Indigenous organizations. So, and I think really the great thing about our organization, about UINR, is that we don't just stay true to our goals. We actually incorporate our goals as principles in how we do our work, and not just what we work on. And, by considering governance and participation and the use of two-eyed seeing to inform decision makers and ourselves, and having a partnership, approach, we take a step back and we allow community in particular to direct and to own and to lead, while we provide that support for them to do so. So we address gaps in governance with advisory committees that have purpose and structure and accountability. There's a lot of, so many organizations that we have in Mi'kmaq are, specifically to inform leadership. And but I think one thing that UINR does well is that we have that accountability to our people in Unama'ki. We created committees that within our communities to guide the direction of habitat restoration. So like looking at rivers that have spirit, to inform our work. We developed research committees specifically to address Mi'kmaq knowledge gaps and understanding that relationship we have to place to inform decision makers and natural resources. And we continue to have meetings to address some things like species at risk listings, and so that we are informed by our people, and those are the ones who will be impacted. I mean, we are rights holders, but those who we depend on to carry out those traditions in ways, that have been passed down to them, and they are entrusted to do so and guide that next generation. It takes time and trust and to learn from a community. So it's not just about the rights holders, it's about ensuring that our knowledge keepers are, are valued and have a place in as equal participants in natural resource management. And for the most part, while we have taken the approach that, definitely species are important, the relationship between our Mi'kmaq harvesters and the species that rely upon are actually inseparable. So it becomes as much as a people or a cultural question as it would a biological or ecological issue. And of course, this is where sustainability and Mi'kmaq rights will intersect. And I think those are really the strengths that we have at UINR. I had asked the question, what is UINR, known for? And apparently it's engagement or working with community. And how we do it is, requires some reflection, like over, more than a decade of our interactions with community. But, we try to create better relationships. We try to create partnerships, and we create working relationships with communities. We build the trust and the credibility, and I think importantly, accountability. So we're not just accountable to a leadership, we're accountable to our people that we serve and who serve on our committees that inform us. And, for the most part, that takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, and it takes learning from mistakes. It takes unlearning and relearning, and it's about being open and honest and transparent, respectful, feeling valued, and being able to have people see themselves in the things that we write and our responses and actions, and taking the responsibility for that. And, importantly, I think like having courage to do so is probably one of the biggest things that we've overcome. Like we have to have the courage to say what our people think, to provide that to our leadership. And, sometimes it's not easy, but, that courage is, I think, really important consideration that we have to have. And, there's a fine line between, for the most part, innovation and risk. So, if you want to be innovative, there is some risk to doing so. But we learned a lot from our knowledge keepers. Nediglum, for example, has a super long definition about sustainability, but it can be broken down into some of those actions that are people taking as a collection, maybe of like perhaps principles that's expressed in our actions as when people are hunting and fishing, taking what we need and preventing waste, giving back through ceremony and sharing. Sharing is a big part of Nediglum. And I think the beauty and the challenge of Netigalump is that there's really no one way to do this. There's so much diversity in Netigalump, but that at the same time, there's consistency. You can see these principles, incorporated in moose or in fishing or in gathering, and it's same but different. And I think this ultimately holds true for two-eyed seeing as well. It is diverse and consistent, and there are many different ways to look at the application and practice of two-eyed seeing. And Albert speaks specifically to like using the benefits and the strengths of each knowledge system for the benefit of all. And when we think about strengths, there really are values. And I think it can be used definitely to get a better understanding of differences between knowledge systems. It can be used as a research framework, and definitely I think it has great value in being able to use to find solutions. So when we're getting to that point about trying to find solutions, we realize that there are shared values that can bridge knowledge systems, but there'll always be diversity in how to achieve that shared value. And I think this is a people culture thing as well. And this is the main difference between knowledge systems as we're going forward. I think that, when we're talking about, moderate livelihood and the definition of moderate livelihood in Netigalump, I think we're missing a big step. I think that there's a big focus on, moderate livelihood as a economic definition, and not necessarily, conceptualized as a way of life, as Mi'kmaq fisheries are. And this is without reference to any treaty or Aboriginal rights. So I think if we're starting to think about, moderate livelihood definition, it is, not necessarily just Supreme Court references as Aboriginal as food, social, ceremonial, and then treaty as livelihood fishing. I think if we think of these things together, as the fishers have suggested, that it can be used for, either food, ceremonial, trade, barter, sale, or an economic gain, from the concept of a fishery, a Mi'kmaq fishery, one that can be used for multiple purposes. And this may, in fact, alleviate some of those challenges that we have with one type of license authorizing, and I don't like to use the word authorizing by DFO, but if we're looking at it from a two-eyed seeing perspective, what are the strengths of a Western knowledge system and implementing the strengths of Mi'kmaq knowledge systems? I think that, they view their strength as their regulation. So, having that authorization from the Fisheries Act, while it means not as important from a Mi'kmaq perspective, it does help the non-Western, the Western knowledge system recognize some of their authority as well. But at the same time, like, there is, confusion right now. Is this a food fishery or is this a moderate livelihood fishery? But really it is a fishery, and that's something that should be recognized. And when we're talking about, what are we governing for, in terms of reconciliations, a Mi'kmaq fishery is one that supports not just the collective, but also the individual's physical, cultural, and economic needs, and also spiritual needs. It is self-governed and ethical, shared, responsible, respectful, and intermittent. And I think intermittent is one of those challenges that is, we face when we're trying to deal with, reconciliation. Is that, it's a needs-based fishery. It's something where, you may be fishing one week and not the next month. So like, it's really, one of those fisheries that doesn't really fall under the regulatory regime of how economic fisheries are governed or managed. And it's also reflective of, that needs-based fishery with the ability to move among Mi'kmaq districts while still respecting that, Mi'kmaq districts have their own challenges around, supporting a number of people that live there and rely on the ecosystem for their needs. So, I think that ultimately, most of the Mi'kmaq concepts of fishing are based in Netigalump. And this suggests that, governance based on the image of Netigalump is tangible. There are ways to share, there are ways to incorporate taking what you need, ways to incorporate how you prevent waste. And that, the legal definition of a right to the Aboriginal treaty also imparts an image that should be taken into consideration for governing purposes. And I think that needs to be, one type of fishery, and have those appropriate policies relying on those things. So I think I'll leave it at that and turn it back to Jane. Lalio.
Oh, Walal and Shelley, thank you so much for those insights and that message around the values. Really, what are the values are critical for us going forward in the dialogues? How can we should we come to some common values, and where can we have the consistencies but the diversity as well? So between you and Tyler and John, we've had a really rich session, and I see that Elder Carey has joined us. I'm not sure if he can verbalize or not because of our technology. Are we going to try to see if Elder Carey can say hello? And
Let's definitely try. So Carrie, if you can come off mute, and we'll try this on your phone. Wonder if he's having trouble with it. There we go.
hello. We're not hearing you. Is your phone on mute?
Hello.
There he
There
is.
you are. Yay.
We did it.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Finally.
wonderful. We finally found you in the
Oh.
technological universe. Carrie, we're just about to wrap up, but I was wondering if you
Okay.
would share with us just briefly. We always love your wisdom, and you've been part of the dialogues trying to find common ground for decades in the fisheries. What do we need to do today and tomorrow? What do we need to do? What do we need to learn?
I'm currently at a climate change conference, and had a lot of talk about changes that are happening, in community all over the world, and fishery is a part of it. I really, I remember, just through the Marshall 25th anniversary, going through all the stories and the things that we went through in this battle to get treaty recognition and rights recognition, and how everybody has been adjusting ever since those times. And here we have climate change, really happening in the midst of all of our struggles, trying to really come to a common point and a common way of looking at the fishery and utilizing the fishery. We're having our own struggles, and yet there are bigger struggles that are happening to not only people, but to the resource itself. And I really, when I think about the struggles we had, I know we've not been really big involved in the fishery as far as bucking is concerned, or being involved in the signing of any agreements, anything with the process through whether it's Sparrow or the average fishing strategy or the Marshall agreements. But yet we are fishing, utilize this license that was set aside for us, and fishing alongside with the non-native fishery, utilizing those licenses and going by the current regulations and seasons. And we had a few people that wanted to, venture into their own food fishery, their own modern livelihood. We continue to operate our food fishery without any signed agreements, and we've just been going along ever since to this day, fishing salmon and other fish without really having any troubles on water, any attractions with DF or anybody. We meet up with each other, we'd identify who we are and what we're doing, and we just go along our way. But since we started moving along in the modern livelihood realm, it became difficult. Because one of the things, because we sat back and watched, the agreements go through and watched, many communities suffer with it, but we've seen a lot of communities that really benefited from them and really utilized the money and the gear and the things they got, and created really good sound management plans and science and data gathering, and it's really impressive how these communities moved ahead. We are just moving along. A lot of our people decided that they were mostly concerned about food fishing, and food fishing is probably one of the most important things that we've come to rely on, and the freedom of fishing for food whenever, however, and whenever we need it. And we've come certainly, we landed right in the middle of this current issue that we're going through, and that'd be the deal, the overfishery. And that's really spelled out a lot of the concerns we had in this whole fishery thing. You know, here we have a fish, you know, that's currently being fished commercially, food, and it's currently being fished at all of its life forms. And it's creating a lot of trouble. And I think this is the catalyst where we can really, if we do things right, we can learn how to continue on with the rest of the fisheries. We, you know, Nova Scotia, Antigonish, Pumpkin Harbor especially, you know, with the abundance of eels it had and the great events that happened in recognition of our commercial right to fish through Marshall, it really sustained us, you know, with food, you know, with culture, with food security, you know, intergenerational food security. And here we are today, really concerned about this continuation of, you know, intergenerational food security. You know, when we see for the first time ever that, you know, Pumpkin Harbor and Antigonish Harbor is really going through a shortage of the large eel population, where we are getting very concerned about intergenerational food security. And seeing what's happening around us with intergenerational wealth being secured by, you know, the sale of elvers, you know, people making millions of dollars. And also, you know, a continuation of the commercial fishery and the real obstruction of returning adult eels from the larger rivers up in Ontario and Quebec, which are being cut up by the power dams. It really tells us what's really going on in the whole world of fishery when it comes to the commercialized fishery, the industry that is allowed to do things and not get charged for killing fish through the Fisheries Act, and the demonizing of the livelihood fisheries by being non-sanctioned. I think, you know, we've got to really look back at what's really going on and really take priority on the resource itself, and really help, you know, really look at each other and how we're utilizing the resource. It'll only, you know, if this continues in one species, it's only going to continue in other species as we all try to, I guess, get our part of that resource, whether it's for food, whether it's for, you know, livelihood, or commercial, recreation, whatever it is. Meanwhile, you know, climate change is really taking a toll on the fish itself. They're moving. All other species are suffering, and everything is going in a bad way. And it worries me. And to a point that, you know, I feel we have to get along as people. We really have to get our act together in doing things right for the resource, doing things right for our great-grandchildren and their children. They're all in jeopardy because of our actions, because of our disagreements, because of our inability to, you know, recognize rights, recognize everybody's need to make a living, to recognize for food, you know, to recognize a future for all of us. And I think we have to start really compromising what we want for the needs of everybody. Our livelihoods, you know, we have a very expensive lifestyle today compared to our ancestors. We were very simple. We just lived off the land, lived off the food that was there. And today, we've been always trying to create a better life for our children, and then these children want to create a better life for their children. And it's been costing the resources more and more. And we're at a point in time now, I don't think the resource can maintain that. It's going to be hard for all of us to set back, our lifestyles, to set back for the things that we want, and come to an equilibrium with the resource, with ourselves, and move on in a good way for the future. I don't know much more to say about how we're going to move
But
forward.
you've said a lot. Thank you. Thank you as ever.
Yeah.
You've guided us in what needs to be done next and what to pay attention to. But thank you, Walal, thank you so much. Kasalul, as always.
Thank you, and I apologize for this.
No, it's great that you were
Very,
here.
very
I'm going to turn it back over to Jason now. Thank you
Okay.
all.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carrie, and thank you to all the panelists, Jane, John, Tyler, Shelley, and Carrie. This has been a wonderful, wonderful webinar. Thank you for sharing these perspectives and the project with us more broadly. We're a little bit over time, so I think we have to leave without the Q&A session. But I will say, for those who are still on, and I put it in the chat, if you have any other questions that you put in the chat, or if you have afterwards, please contact myself and the project team, and we'll be in touch directly with you. And I see Jane nodding, so that's great. But thank you to the panelists. Thanks to you all for attending today. And it was a wonderful turnout, and we're really looking forward to seeing the progress of this project moving forward, and all of the dialogues within the talking circles that this team is so brilliantly putting together and implementing. So thanks, everybody, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye.
No, thank you very much. Safe
No,
travels, you guys. Safe travels.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
This